The padlock on the pantry door was newer than everything around it. Dale Kowalik stood in a kitchen that had not cooked a meal for the county in 68 years, and looked at a hasp somebody had screwed into good oak within the last few winters. The metal still bright at the edges where a key had worn it. He had a flashlight in one hand and a crowbar he didn't want to use in the other. Behind that door, when he finally got it open, he would find 200 cans of food rotated on a schedule, boots in 6 different sizes, and enough blankets to sleep a dozen strangers through a Nebraska January. He did not know that yet. He only knew the lock did not belong to a building the county had condemned before his own mother was born. 3 weeks before that morning, though, the story starts in a gravel lot outside Broken Bow, Nebraska, with a man who had $340 to his name. Dale Kowalik was 46 years old and he had driven trucks for 22 of them. He had hauled cattle feed out of Kearney and windmill blades out of the port at Corpus Christi, and twice a load of caskets from a manufacturer in Batesville, Indiana, that he never told anyone about because people always wanted to make a joke of it. He had a commercial license with no violations on it, and a back that had finally quit on him in a truck stop parking lot outside North Platte in August, folding him over the fuel pump handle so completely that a woman pumping diesel 2 islands down had called 911 before he could tell her not to. The MRI in Kearney showed what the doctor called a frank rupture at L4-L5, disc material sitting on a nerve root like a boot on a garden hose. Surgery was an option, the doctor said, if Dale had insurance that covered it, which he did not since the company he drove for cut his health plan in a round of belt tightening 2 years back, and he'd been riding on a cheap catastrophic policy ever since. Without surgery, the doctor said, Dale could probably walk fine, stand fine, do most things fine. He could not sit upright in a truck seat for the 11 hours a route required. Not anymore. Not ever again, most likely. His ex-wife Connie found out from his cousin Walt, not from Dale, and sent a text that said she was sorry, and meant it, he thought, as much as a person 4 years remarried can mean anything about a life they've already closed the book on. His daughter Megan, 24 and settled in Tucson, called once, said the things a daughter says, and did not offer what neither of them expected her to offer. Dale did not blame either of them. He had spent 22 years gone 3 weeks out of 4. A man does not get to be surprised later that nobody is standing at the door. He owed $9,100 on the truck itself, a 2009 Freightliner Cascadia, with 640,000 miles on it, and the truck was the only asset he had left that was worth anything, except it wasn't worth much anymore either, not with a check engine light he couldn't afford to chase down and a sleeper cab that had become, by late September, his address. He sold the tools out of the underbelly box for $200 at a truck stop outside Ogallala. He sold his wedding ring, which he had kept for reasons he could not have explained to anyone, for $60 at a pawn shop in Kearney that didn't ask why a man was selling a ring alone. By the time he pulled the Freightliner into the gravel lot behind the Sandhills Travel Plaza on the east edge of Broken Bow, Custer County, Nebraska, on the 2nd of October, he had $340 in a rubber-banded fold in the truck's glove box, and a cousin 40 minutes away named Walt Kowalik, who had a spare room and had told him, more than once, that the door was open whenever Dale was ready to use it. Dale was not ready to use it. A man does not sleep in his cousin's spare room if he can still park his own truck somewhere legal and call it his own bed, and the lot behind the travel plazas let overnight parking for truckers passing through. No questions, $5 a night if you wanted a shower in the morning. Dale mostly didn't. He ate gas station sandwiches and instant coffee heated on a single burner he plugged into the cab's inverter, and he told himself this was temporary. The way a man tells himself a lot of things are temporary, right up until they aren't. He walked in the mornings because the doctor had told him to, and because there was nothing else to do with the hours. Broken Bow was a small county seat, a courthouse with a green dome you could see from 3 miles out on the highway, a grain elevator, a main street with more empty storefronts than full ones, and a few that had been reborn as antique shops, and a coffee place that opened at 7. Dale walked the edges of town where there was less to look at, and less chance of running into anyone who might ask what a man his age was doing, walking slow with his hand pressed flat against the small of his back, like he was holding something in. That was how he found the fence line north of Ash Street, past the old rail spur where the grain cars used to load, and the two-story brick building standing behind it with its windows boarded and its roofline sagging at one corner like a shoulder that had given up holding itself square. He had walked past it twice before he noticed that the copper wire poking out of a section of collapsed soffit, bright where it caught the morning light, and thought, the way a man with $340 starts thinking about anything metal and unclaimed, that scrapyards in Kearney paid by the pound, and a truck bed full of stripped wire and pipe was $200 or $300 he badly needed. He was not the first to think it. Somebody had already pried a sheet of plywood off a side door years back, and raccoons or worse had been in and out of the building long enough that the smell hit him before he was 10 feet past the threshold. Mildew and dust and something colder underneath it, mineral, like a root cellar. A hand-lettered sign zip-tied to the fence, faded almost past reading, said Custer County Property, no trespassing, and under that, in different older paint, Poor Farm Dormitory, established 1911. Dale had grown up in Nebraska. He knew in the vague way most people know a piece of local history nobody teaches in school anymore, that a poor farm was where a county used to put people it had nowhere else to put, the old, the disabled, the friendless before there were pensions or nursing homes or much of anything else. He knew the state had shut them all down by the late 50s. He had never wondered, before that morning, what happened to the building after. He was circling the west wing, looking for a way onto the low porch roof to get at more of the wire, when he saw the rocking chair. It sat on the porch of the west wing, the one part of the building that still had glass in most of its windows, under an overhang that had kept 60 years of weather off it. Well enough that the wood hadn't rotted through the way everything else had. There was a woman in the chair. Dale's first thought, standing at the bottom of the porch steps with his mouth going dry, was that she was asleep. An old woman in a house dress and a cardigan the color of oatmeal, a folded quilt over her knees, her hands resting one over the other in her lap like she'd settled them there on purpose. It was the stillness of the hands that told him before anything else did. Nobody sleeps that still. He climbed the 3 steps anyway, slow, favoring his back, and said, "Ma'am?" Twice and then a third time quieter, already knowing. She had been dead, he would learn later from the coroner, somewhere between 1 and 3 days. There was frost on the quilt. Her face, when he made himself look at it directly, was not frightened or in pain, only closed, the way a house looks closed when the people who lived in it have already gone. On the small table beside the chair sat a mug with a half-inch of coffee gone to a skin in the bottom, and a paperback novel splayed open and face down to hold her place, and a pair of reading glasses folded neat beside it. Nothing about the scene looked like an accident or a struggle. It looked like a woman who had sat down to read on her own porch, in her own chair, on her own land, or land she had treated as her own, for longer than the county that owned it on paper had probably remembered it existed, and simply had not gotten back up. Dale did not touch anything. He had hauled enough loads through enough small towns to know what you did, and did not do at a scene like that. He walked back out to the road, called 911 on a phone with 11% battery, and told the dispatcher there was a dead woman on the porch of the old Poor Farm building on Ash Street, and no, he didn't know her name, and yes, he'd stay until somebody got there. He sat down on the bottom porch step to wait, because his back wouldn't let him stand for the 20 minutes it took the Custer County Sheriff's deputy to arrive, and from that angle, at that distance, he could see through the porch's screen door into the front room of the West Wing for the first time. Not the ruin he'd expected from the outside, but a small, ordinary, lived-in room. A braided rug. A wood stove with a kettle on it. A calendar on the wall, current year, with days crossed off in pencil right up to a date 6 days back. Whoever this woman was, Dale understood, sitting there with his back against the cold brick, and the frost still silvering the porch boards in the shade. She had not been a trespasser passing through a ruin. She had been living here. She had been living here the whole time. Her name was Ruth Behrens, the deputy told him, once the sheriff's office had run the plates on an ancient Buick parked in a lean-to behind the building, and matched them to a registration nobody had bothered updating since 2011. 94 years old. No listed next of kin. A brother had died in Korea in 1952, and there was nothing else in the county's records but her own name, decade after decade, on a handful of utility accounts that had never been shut off. The coroner's office in Kearney would rule it natural causes within the week. Her heart, sometime in the last days of September, sitting in her own chair with a book in her lap, which was, Dale thought later, about as gentle a way to go as a person got. What surprised him was the county's response to a body found on county property. Custer County did not have a functioning next of kin file, did not have a will, did not have anyone who could legally speak for Ruth Behrens or her effects, and the building she died in was still, on paper, an asset of Custer County itself. Condemned, unmaintained, technically owned by the very government that had forgotten it existed. That made it a matter for the county's public administrator, a soft-spoken woman named Sharon Voss, who worked out of a windowless office on the courthouse's second floor, and who called Dale 3 days after he found the body, tracking him down through the police report, because he was the one who'd found her. It struck Dale as almost funny, in the flat way things strike a man who has stopped expecting good luck, that he was, as far as the county could determine, the only person connected to the case with a verifiable legal address in Custer County at all. "It's not what you're picturing," Sharon Voss told him, sitting across a metal desk from him with a manila folder open between them, the morning he came in, at her request. She was maybe 60, gray hair cut short and practical, reading glasses pushed up on her head. "I need somebody to hold the property secure while probate sorts out what happens to it. Insure it against vandalism. Keep an eye on it. Report anything that changes. Sign for deliveries if there are any. It's caretaker of record. Interim. It is not a gift, and it is not a job offer, and it does not mean the building is yours. When probate closes, could be 3 months, could be longer, if we can't establish an heir. The county takes it back and does whatever it does with condemned property, which is usually nothing for another decade, and then eventually a demolition order." She'd looked at him over the glasses. "The stipend is $400 a month out of what's left in Miss Behrens's small estate account, which isn't much. I have to be honest with you, Mr. Kowalik, this is not a good deal for you. I called you because you're the only name on this desk with an address Walt Kowalik will vouch for, and because you're the one who found her, and in my experience that means something to a person, whether they want it to or not." Sharon Voss had run the public administrator's office for 11 years by then, long enough to have signed off on the disposition of a dozen forgotten county properties nobody else wanted to touch. And something in the way she said it, not a gift, not a job offer, told Dale she had made this exact speech before, to other men in other rooms, and watched most of them decline. "Most people hear condemned building and $400, and they're gone before I finish the sentence," she said, closing the folder. "I'm not going to pretend this is a good offer. I'm going to tell you it's an honest one, and there aren't many of those left on this desk." Dale had $400 a month coming to nothing, $340 in a rubber-banded fold, and a truck he was 3 payments from losing outright. He signed the papers. He moved his few things, a duffel bag, a cooler, a sleeping bag rated for temperatures he hoped he wouldn't test it against, into the West Wing's front room 2 days later, the same room with the braided rug and the wood stove he'd seen through the screen door. It was, if he was honest, more shelter than the truck cab had been, and it did not cost him $5 a night. He told himself that was the only reason he was doing it. He did not examine, that first week, why he found himself standing in the doorway of Ruth Behrens's front room some evenings, looking at the calendar with its pencil marks stopping mid-September, or why it bothered him more than he expected that nobody in this county had known this woman was still alive. The rest of the building, when Sharon Voss walked him through it with a county maintenance man named Kurt and a ring of keys, nobody was sure still opened anything, was exactly the ruin Dale had expected from the outside. The East Wing had lost half its roof sometime in the 90s, by Kurt's guess, judging from the water damage, staining down 3 floors of plaster like a long brown bruise. Most of the interior doors were swollen shut or hanging by one hinge. The old dining hall on the ground floor still had its long tables, warped and buckled, a chalkboard on one wall with a menu written on it in handwriting nobody living had made. Meatloaf, boiled potatoes, a Sunday dessert. Dale couldn't read past the water stains. It was a building the county had been paying, in a distant and forgetful way, to slowly fall down for almost 70 years. Except for the west wing, which was dry, swept sound. Off the small kitchen behind Ruth's front room, in a pantry that should have been as empty and picked over as everything else in the building, Dale found a door with a hasp and padlock newer than any hardware in 100 yards of it. He almost didn't open it. He told himself, standing there with the flashlight and the crowbar he didn't want to use, that it was probably nothing, an old woman's habit of locking up her canned peaches, nothing a caretaker needed to go prying into. Still, Sharon Voss had asked him to report anything unusual, and a fresh padlock on a pantry in a condemned building was unusual by any measure. So he worked the hasp screws loose with a driver from his truck's toolbox instead of breaking the lock, because it felt like something you did carefully, out of some respect he couldn't have named for a woman he'd never spoken to. The pantry was 8 feet by 10, shelved floor to ceiling on 3 walls, and it was full. Not full of the dust-caked relics Dale expected, jars gone black, boxes chewed through by mice. It was full and current instead. Cans of vegetables and soup stacked by type, the newest labels dated that same year. 50-pound bags of rice and flour, 2 open and rubber-banded shut, 3 more sealed. A shelf of work boots in a run of sizes, from what looked like a boy's youth, 10 up through a man's 13, paired and laced together at the top so they wouldn't separate. Wool blankets, Army surplus green, folded in a stack as tall as Dale's waist. A first aid kit the size of a toolbox, restocked recently enough that the gauze wrappers still had a drugstore's price sticker on them, dated in July. On the bottom shelf, behind a row of coffee cans repurposed to hold loose change and small tools, Dale found a shoebox of children's picture books, spines cracked soft from handling, and beside it 3 board games missing most of their pieces, and a coffee tin of crayons worn down to nubs. None of it matched a 94-year-old woman living alone. It matched a household that had at one time or another needed to keep a child occupied on a bad night. Dale stood in the doorway a long time, with the flashlight beam moving slow across the shelves, doing the sort of arithmetic a man does without meaning to. A 94-year-old woman living alone in a condemned building did not need 200 cans of food and boots in 6 sizes. A woman keeping house for herself kept a week's groceries and maybe a coat for the one man who might visit. This was provisioning. This was a pantry stocked, on a schedule, for people who were not Ruth Barron's. He was still standing there, trying to make the numbers mean something less than what they plainly meant, when he heard a car door outside and a woman's voice calling through the propped-open side entrance. Not. A name only a bright businesslike hello. Anybody in here? And he stepped out of the pantry to find a young woman standing in the dining hall, with a phone, held up filming the water-stained ceiling, a canvas bag, over one shoulder, with a reporter's notebook sticking out of it. She introduced herself as Priya Desai, staff writer for the Custer County Beacon. And she told him, with the particular friendliness of a person who has rehearsed the opening line, been trying to get someone from the county to let her into this building for 3 weeks. You must be the caretaker, she said, lowering the phone. Sharon Voss told me somebody'd been appointed. I didn't mean to walk in on you like this. I'm sorry, the side door was open. She looked past him toward the pantry, and Dale saw her eyes catch, for half a second, on the open padlock still sitting on the shelf where he'd set it, and on the boots, and on the stacked blankets visible past his shoulder. And he understood, with the flat certainty of a man who has spent 22 years reading truck stop faces for trouble, that she had already seen more than he wanted her to see. I've been getting an anonymous tip for months, Priya said, not unkindly, but not backing off either. Somebody called the paper back in July and said there was an unlicensed shelter running out of the old poor farm. Kids, men out of the state hospital, women leaving bad situations, off the books, no inspections, nothing. I didn't believe it until Ruth Barron's turned up dead out here, and I found out the county's had her on a meal account line item in the poor farm's old operating budget since 1959. 1959, Mr. Kowalik. The county closed this place in '58. She let that sit a second. I'm not trying to make trouble for you, but I think that woman was running something out here for almost 70 years. And I think it's a real story. And I'm going to write it whether you help me or not. I'd rather write it right. Dale looked at her, and then back at the pantry behind him, and said the only true thing he had. I don't know what she was running yet either. Priya left him a business card and a request to call before he cleared anything out, which he had no plans to do and no budget to accomplish even if he had. And Dale spent that evening sitting at Ruth's kitchen table with the pantry door standing open, eating a can of her soup because it seemed less wasteful than letting it go to a dumpster, and because $340 being $340, he was hungry. He kept thinking about the boots. 6 sizes, laced together in pairs so a person could grab a set and walk. That was not a hoarder's habit. That was somebody keeping a mudroom ready for feet that weren't there yet. He called Walt that night, mostly because he needed to hear another human voice say something ordinary. Walt, predictably, wanted to know if Dale had lost his mind moving into a building that had a dead woman's coffee mug still sitting on the porch table, and Dale said probably, and Walt laughed and then got quiet and said, "You remember Gene Ostrander? Drove the mail route out that way for about 100 years. He'd know something about that old place, if anybody does. He's still out at the Legion most Tuesday and Thursday afternoons." Dale had grown up 2 towns over, and only half remembered a lanky old mail carrier from Sunday dinners at his grandmother's. But a name was a start, and starts were in short supply. He found Gene Ostrander at the American Legion Hall on a Thursday, 81 years old, playing cribbage with 3 other men who all looked like they'd been playing the same hand of cribbage since Eisenhower, and when Dale said he was staying out at the old poor farm, Gene set his cards down flat on the table and looked at him for a long moment before he said anything at all. "You found her," Gene said. "Not a question." "I found her," Dale said. Gene nodded slowly, the way old men nod when a thing they've been waiting to happen for a long time finally happens. "I carried mail out that road for 41 years, he said. Custer County Route 6. There wasn't supposed to be a stop out there. County closed that address off the postal registry back in '58. Same year they closed the building. Ruth had a box put up at the end of the drive in about '60, though, private box, paid for out of her own pocket, and I'd swing by it same as any other stop, because a man doesn't drive past a mailbox with a flag up and simply leave it, even if the government says there's nobody living there." He looked at his cards, didn't pick them back up. She got more mail than you'd think. Letters from people. Not bills, mostly, actual letters, the kind people used to write. I never read them, understand. I carried enough of them over enough years to know, though, that woman had more people who thought of her than most folks in this town with a whole family. Over the next hour, in pieces, with the other cribbage players adding a detail here and there, like men laying down card that had been holding a long time, Dale got the shape of it. Ruth Behrens had come to the poor farm in 1953 as a 21-year-old matron, hired by the county to help run the kitchen and the laundry for the 60-some residents the building held, in those years the old, the disabled, men and women who had nowhere else the depression and the war and plain bad luck had left them to go. When the state phased the almshouse system out in 1958, and the county shuttered the building, every other staff member had taken the severance and moved on. Ruth had not. Nobody at the Legion table could say exactly why, though Gene had a theory he offered carefully, like he wasn't sure it was his to say. That Ruth had grown up an orphan herself, bounced between relatives in 3 counties before she was old enough to work, and that the poor farm, for all its grimness, might have been the first place that ever felt to her like she had a job worth keeping people alive to do. She never really left, Gene said. County forgot about the building inside of 10 years, way counties do. Ruth didn't forget it had a roof and 4 walls and a working well, and she didn't forget there was always somebody in this county with nowhere to sleep. Fella comes out of the state hospital in Hastings with no family and a bus ticket to nowhere. Girl runs off from a bad house with nothing but what's in her coat pockets. Old bachelor out on some Sandhills ranch who finally can't work anymore and's got nobody. This is cattle country, Mr. Kowalik. Folks around here don't talk much about who falls through. Still, somebody's always falling. One of the other cribbage players, a heavy-set man named Orville Pruitt, who Jean introduced simply as used to drive the school bus, set his hand down too and said he remembered a February back in the mid-60s when his own school bus route ran past the poor farm's fence line every morning before dawn, headlights catching a shape moving along the drive toward the mailbox. Ruth, out in a coat over her nightclothes, hauling a second-hand crib somebody in town had left her, half a mile from the road to the porch by herself, because she didn't want to wait for daylight to bring a baby in out of the cold. Never asked who the baby belonged to, Orville said. Wasn't a question you asked Ruth Barons. Jean added, quieter than before, that his own younger sister had spent 9 days out at the poor farm in 1967, after a marriage that ended badly enough that the county sheriff at the time still talked about it decades later, and that Jean had never once, in 50-some years of carrying that route, let on to another living soul that he knew it, because Ruth had asked him, one time only, not two. Dale asked carefully if Jean knew how many people. Jean shook his head. Never counted. Wasn't my business to count. He did the arithmetic slow, the way a man does when the number surprises even him as it forms. I'd guess, though, over 60-some years, more than you'd think possible out of one old woman and a pension check. Dale went back to the West Wing that night and, for the first time since he'd moved in, walked past the front room and up the narrow staircase to the second floor of the building, the part he'd assumed, from the outside and from Kurt the maintenance man's brief, dismissive tour, was as derelict as the East Wing. It wasn't. The stairs were swept. The hall light, an old pull-chain fixture, still worked when he tried it, casting a weak yellow glow down a corridor of 10 doors, 5 to a side, that Dale had walked past twice already without trying a single handle. He tried the nearest one. It opened onto a plain dormitory room, not one bed but two, a room meant to sleep a pair, both beds made tight with wool blankets tucked hospital corner sharp, both with a folded set of clothes at the foot. On one, a man's flannel shirt and canvas trousers, folded square as if by a drill sergeant. On the other, a woman's cardigan and a plain cotton dress. On each pillow, a strip of adhesive tape had been pressed down with a set of initials written on it in ballpoint pen. JM on one, no date visible. On the other, more recent by the tape's whiter color, DK, and Dale's stomach did something strange and cold when he saw those two letters. Before he made himself remember that DK wasn't unusual, that Dale Kowalik wasn't the only man in Custer County with those initials, that it was almost certainly a coincidence and nothing more. He told himself that twice, before he believed it enough to keep moving. Room after room down the hall told the same story with different names on the tape. 11 beds total across 5 rooms, all made, all with clothing folded at the foot, most of the initials faded to the amber brown of decades-old adhesive, 2 or 3 startlingly fresh. A closet at the end of the hall held more folded clothing in stacks, sorted by size, men's and women's, and Dale's throat tightened at this, 3 sets clearly a child's, small enough for a boy of 8 or 9. Somebody had kept this hall ready. Not as a museum. Not as a shrine to what the poor farm used to be. Ready, the way you keep a guest room ready for a relative who might call any night and need a bed by morning. Except this was 11 beds, kept ready for 60 years, by a woman with no family the county's records could find. Dale sat down on the edge of the nearest empty bed, not the one marked DK. He made himself choose a different one, though he couldn't have said why it mattered, and understood, for the first time with real weight instead of curiosity, that he had wandered into the middle of something a great deal larger than an old woman's eccentric habit of overstocking a pantry. 2 nights later, straightening the small dresser in Ruth's own bedroom, while he waited for the ache in his back to ease enough to climb the stairs again, Dale found a framed photograph face down in the bottom drawer. Glass cracked in one corner from some fall long before his time. A young man in an army uniform, dark-haired, unsmiling in the way old photographs made everyone look, and on the back in the same careful cursive as the ledger's first pages. My brother Walter. Korea, 1952. He did not come home. Beside the photograph, wrapped in a handkerchief, gone yellow with age, sat a telegram from the War Department, its creases so soft from handling that it had nearly split along every fold. Dale sat on the edge of Ruth's bed a long time with the photograph in his hands, doing the sort of arithmetic that had nothing to do with money. A 21-year-old girl, already an orphan, losing the one relative she had left the year before she came to work at the poor farm, and staying on afterward not because she had nowhere else to go, Dale understood now, but because she had decided, in the particular grief of a person with no one left to lose, that she would simply refuse to let that happen to anyone else if she could help it. Priya Desai called him 2 mornings later, and this time she didn't ask permission to come out. She told him, in the flat voice of a reporter reading from notes she'd already half-written, that she'd pulled Custer County's old poor farm operating ledgers from the courthouse archive. Public record, she reminded him. She didn't need his cooperation for that part, and found resident meal accounts logged against the building's budget every single year, from 1959 clear through the present, funded, as far as she could tell, entirely out of Ruth Behrens's own pension deposits, routed through an account the county's own auditor had apparently never once flagged. That's 66 years of an unlicensed group home operating on county-owned condemned property. Off every book except one woman's private bank ledger, Priya said. I've got a source at the state health department already asking questions about what could have gone wrong out there over that many decades with zero oversight. A fire, an assault, anything, and nobody would have ever known. I'm running the story in 3 weeks, Mr. Kowalik, with or without more from you. I'd rather it be with. I think you know things I need. Dale, standing in the second-floor hall with 11 made beds behind him and a set of initials he still hadn't stopped thinking about, said he needed time to think. And Priya, not unkindly but not warmly either, said that time was the one thing she couldn't promise him much of. He spent the 3 days after that call doing the only thing he knew how to do with a problem too big to see the edges of. He started at one end of it and worked, methodically, the way he'd once worked a route he couldn't see the far end of either. He cleared the pantry inventory onto a legal pad, counted the beds twice, wrote down every set of initials he could find. He fixed the hall light's loose fixture with electrical tape from his truck's toolbox, because it seemed wrong to leave it flickering. His back did not thank him for the stairs, 4 and 5 trips a day. And by the 3rd evening he was taking the over-the-counter pills 2 at a time, and lying flat on the front room floor for an hour before he trusted himself to stand again. He did not call Sharon Voss to report any of it yet. He told himself he needed to understand what he was reporting before he handed it to anyone, not Priya, not the county, not even Jean, and some smaller, more honest part of him understood that he had started to feel, in a way he had no right to feel about a stranger's building, protective. It was on the 4th day, working loose a section of warped baseboard in Ruth's own bedroom to see whether water had gotten in behind it, that his thumb caught the edge of a floorboard that gave under pressure in a way the boards around it didn't. He worked it up with a putty knife, careful, the way he'd have handled a load he didn't want to drop, and found a shallow cavity between the joists holding a small tin lockbox, the kind sold at hardware stores for a few dollars to keep a house key safe from burglars who never think to pry up a floor. It was locked. Ruth's key ring, which Sharon Voss had given him along with the county's own keys the day he moved in, hung on a nail by the kitchen door, a dozen keys of every size, most of them for doors Dale had already identified around the building, except one, small and brass, worn smooth, marked with a single scratched letter, L. The lockbox held one thing. A ledger, cloth-bound, dark green, gone gray-green at the corners from handling, its spine cracked soft the way a book gets from being opened thousands of times over a life. Dale sat down on the floor of Ruth Behrens's bedroom with his back against her bed frame, because his back would not let him sit any other way for long, and opened it. The first page was dated in a young woman's careful cursive, March 1958. Below the date a name, Harlan T. No last initial given that first year, as if she hadn't yet decided this was a record worth keeping properly, and 2 lines. What he needed, a place to sleep. Discharged from the state hospital with no family listed. What became of him, stayed 6 weeks. Found work at the elevator in Myrna. Sends a card most Christmases. Dale turned the page. Another name. Another 2 lines. He turned another, and the hand changed slightly across the decades the way handwriting does as a person ages. Bolder in the 60s, tighter and more economical by the 80s, thinner and more deliberate, like it was costing her effort to hold the pen steady in the last 20 years of entries. The form never changed, though. A date. A name, full names appeared more often as the decades went on, as if Ruth had grown less careful about protecting people, or more confident that the record itself was safe. What the person needed in a line. What became of them in a line, sometimes updated years later in a different ink, a postscript squeezed into the margin. Married in 1974. 2 children. Runs the implement dealership now. He read for 4 hours without moving, until his back forced him up, and even then he carried the ledger to the kitchen table and kept reading standing, leaning on the table's edge, because he could not make himself stop. Somewhere past the 70th entry, he lost the ability to think of it as a curiosity, and started, instead, to feel the particular vertigo of understanding a number too large to hold in his head all at once. He went back to the front page, found the date of the most recent entry, 6 weeks before Ruth's death, a young man's name, what he needed. Bus fare and 2 nights, what became of him? Gone north, don't know, hope he's all right. And then, doing arithmetic the way Gene Ostrander had done it at the Legion table, slow and half disbelieving, counted the entries in blocks of 10 until he reached the last page. 194 names. 68 years. An average Dale worked out later on the legal pad, of not quite 3 people a year, though the entries clustered, a run of a dozen in the mid-60s that Dale would later learn, from Gene, tracked with a bad drought and a spate of ranch foreclosures. Almost none through the 70s, a quiet decade. A cluster again in the 90s that Gene guessed was tied to the stat hospital's own downsizing. More people discharged with nowhere built to catch them. Men getting out of Hastings with a bus ticket and no address to give a parole officer. Teenage girls who'd walked out of a house on a county road at 2 in the morning with nothing but a coat. Old bachelors from Sandhills ranches, too far out for anyone to notice they'd stopped coming to town. Women, more of them than Dale expected. Leaving marriages that the county's own courthouse records, he would find later, showed no divorce filing for it all. Women who'd simply left, quietly, with whatever they could carry, and been given, for a few weeks or a season, a bed with their initials on the pillow, and nobody asking questions they weren't ready to answer. Threaded through the entries, unmistakable once Dale started looking for it, were names he recognized. Not many. Enough. A margin note beside an entry from 1971, Robert A. 16, ran from a stepfather's house on the Myrna Road, took him in 11 weeks until the county could place him with an aunt in Grand Island. That Dale read 3 times before he let himself connect it to Judge Robert Anders, who presided over Custer County's district court and whose photograph hung in the courthouse hallway, not 200 feet from Sharon Voss's office. An entry from 1988, Dolores K. 2 young children, left a bad marriage with nothing, stayed 4 months, found her own place with help from the church. That matched, near enough that Dale's hands went cold reading it. The name of Dolores Kemp, vice president at the bank on Main Street, whose photograph Dale had seen that same week smiling out of a Beacon article about a scholarship fund she chaired. An entry from 1979, a name Dale didn't recognize at first, that Gene would later confirm belonged to Earl Priest, who ran the feed store 2 blocks off the square and had shaken Dale's hand at the co-op counter without either of them knowing what the ledger in a dead woman's floorboard already knew about him. Dale sat with the ledger open on the kitchen table. Long after dark that night, and understood, finally, the actual shape of the choice sitting in front of him. This was not a story about an eccentric old woman's pantry, or even about a building the county had forgotten. It was a record of nearly 200 people, most of them still private citizens, somewhere in this county or scattered beyond it, a real number of whom had built respectable, ordinary, hard-won lives on the far side of the worst weeks of those lives. Lives they had every reason to believe nobody but themselves remembered. Priya Desai had 3 weeks and a deadline and a genuine story, sourced from public county records that owed nobody's consent. Dale, meanwhile, had a ledger that would turn every one of those private histories into a headline the moment anybody outside this kitchen knew it existed, a headline that would name Judge Robert Anders, and Dolores Kemp and Earl Priest and 191 people besides, whether they wanted their worst season made public or not. He thought about calling Priya that night and telling her everything, letting the story run big and fast and true, the way she wanted it. County negligence, a building that should have burned to the ground for how it operated for 66 years unregulated. A human interest angle that would get picked up statewide, and maybe force the county to actually save the building instead of quietly demolishing it once probate closed. It would be, in its way, the easier path, and it would very likely be the one that kept the building standing. It would also mean strangers finding out, from a newspaper, that their neighbor the judge had once run from home in the dark, that their bank's vice president had once had nowhere else to sleep before any of them had a chance to say whether they wanted that told at all. Or he could do what Ruth herself, judging by 68 years of a record, kept the way this one was kept, careful, private, never once handed to a reporter or a county auditor in all that time, would almost certainly have wanted done. Find the living names himself, quietly, in whatever order a woman who'd spent a lifetime judging, who needed protecting most, would have judged safest, and let each of them decide, before anyone else did, what became of their own story. It would cost him the only leverage he had over Priya's deadline. It would very likely cost him the building, if the county moved on probate before he'd finished. It would cost him money he did not have, and weeks he needed for finding paying work, and a back that was already telling him, in the language of two-at-a-time pain pills, that it did not have unlimited trips up and down that staircase left in it. He thought, too, of the truck stop parking lot outside North Platte in August, and how word of his own ruined back had gotten around the trucking company inside of 2 days without him telling a soul. A dispatcher who knew a dispatcher, a Facebook group for drivers, his own crumpled dignity handed around 100 strangers before he'd even seen the MRI himself. Nobody had asked him if he wanted that told. He remembered exactly how it felt to have the worst week of his life become somebody else's conversation before he'd had a chance to decide, himself, who got to know about it and who didn't. He was not going to do that to 194 people who had trusted a dead woman with the same thing he'd once had taken from him for free. Dale closed the ledger, sat with his hand flat on its cover for a long moment, the way he'd have rested a hand on a load he was about to sign for, and understood that he had already made the choice, sometime in the last 4 hours of reading, without quite deciding to. He went to Jean Ostrander first, because Jean was the only person alive who might help him do this without doing it badly. He laid the situation out at the Legion Hall, over 2 cups of bad coffee, the ledger, the names he'd recognized, Priya's 3-week clock, and Jean listened with his cribbage cards face down and untouched the whole time, and when Dale finished, Jean said the thing that ended up steadying the rest of it. Ruth didn't write a book that size by accident. She'd have had an order in mind for a thing like this, same as she had an order for everything. Look at who's closest to the end of that ledger and who's been carrying the weight of it longest without anybody helping them carry it. Start there. Dale spent a long evening with the ledger and a legal pad, cross-referencing entries against what Jean could tell him and what he could find in old copies of the Beacon at the county library, and settled on a rough order, not a science he knew. Only the closest he could get to guessing what a woman who'd spent a lifetime reading, who needed the gentlest hand, would have wanted. Earl Priest first, because Earl was 71 now, alone since his wife had passed, and the entry beside his name, 1979, discharged from the state hospital, no family willing to take him, stayed 9 weeks, learned the feed business from a neighbor who gave him a chance, read, to Dale, like a man who might have spent 45 years afraid someone would eventually find out where he'd started. Dolores Kemp second, because her name carried the most public weight of anyone in the ledger, and because a bank vice president had the most to lose if this broke as a headline instead of a conversation. Judge Robert Anders last, not because his standing was less important to protect, but because a sitting judge, Dale reasoned, might have resources and instincts of his own for managing a hard piece of news, where a widowed feed store owner and a small-town bank officer did not. He drove to the feed store on a Tuesday morning in Walt's truck. Since his own Freightliner wasn't built for anything but the interstate, and found Earl Priest behind the counter weighing out a 50-pound sack of chick starter for a rancher's wife, and waited until the store emptied before he said, as plainly and as gently as he knew how, that he was the caretaker out at the old poor farm. That he'd found something of Ruth Barron's that had Earl's name in it from a long time back, and that he wanted Earl to hear it from him, privately before anyone else might come asking. Earl Priest went very still behind the counter. For a long moment, the way a man goes still when a door he'd shut 50 years ago swings open without warning. "I haven't thought about that place and I don't know how long," he said finally, and then quieter. "She never told anybody. Never once, in all the years I've done business 2 blocks from that county, did that woman let on she knew me from before I was anybody." His eyes were wet by the time Dale finished explaining about Priya and the deadline, and the choice Dale had made to come to him first. "You didn't have to do that," Earl said. "You could have let the paper run it, and nobody'd have blamed a caretaker for it." Dale said he didn't know about that, and Earl, after a while, said he'd rather people in this town hear it as a thing Ruth Barron's did right than a thing the county did wrong, and that he'd be glad, when the time came, to say so publicly, in his own words, on his own schedule. Dolores Kemp took it harder at first. Dale met her in the bank's small conference room, at her request rather than at the counter, and watched a composed, professional woman's face come apart for the length of about 90 seconds before she got hold of it again. "I have never told my own husband where I went those 4 months," she said, once she could speak steadily. "He knows I left an earlier marriage. He does not know I had nowhere to go and 2 kids under 5, and a woman I'd never met before let us into a building the county thought was empty." She was quiet a long moment, turning a pen over in her hands. "I chair the scholarship committee. I sit on the library board. I have built a whole life on the other side of that door, and I was never sure, some nights, whether it was real or whether I was only very good at performing that it was." She looked at Dale. "Does the reporter know my name specifically?" "Not yet," Dale said. "Not from me. I don't know what she's found in the county records on her own, but names weren't in what she showed me." Dolores nodded slowly. "Then I'd like the chance to decide, myself, whether my name is ever in her story," she said. "That's the whole of it, isn't it? Whether anyone ever asked me." Judge Robert Anders was harder to get an hour with than a feed store owner. It took Dale nearly a week and a call through Sharon Voss, who by then he had told everything, trusting her the way he'd started, cautiously, to trust the whole small machinery of this county. When they finally spoke, the judge took the news the way Dale imagined a man who spent his working life weighing hard facts calmly might take it. He listened without interrupting, asked 2 precise questions about who else knew, and then sat with his hands folded on his desk in a way that reminded Dale uncomfortably of Ruth's hands folded in her lap on the porch. "I was 16, the judge said finally. "I told myself for years, I imagined half of it, that a woman couldn't really have kept a whole hallway of beds ready like that it must have been smaller than I remembered. Less deliberate. I went back out there once, in my 30s, only to look at the building from the road. Never went in. I told myself I didn't need to." He looked at Dale for a long moment. "You're doing this on your own dime, aren't you? Nobody assigned you to protect 194 strangers." Dale said he wasn't sure anybody had needed to assign it. The work did not come free, and it did not come easy. Dale drove Walt's truck 3-4 days a week to towns across the county, and once as far as Grand Island to find a name whose trail had gone cold locally. Filling the tank on gas money that came straight out of the $340 and the small, irregular caretaker stipend, until, by the middle of November, he had less than $60 left and a stack of unpaid bills he'd stopped opening, because there was nothing in them he could do anything about yet. He climbed the second-floor stairs of the West Wing dozens of times, cross-referencing the ledger against a growing legal pad of names and addresses, until one evening in the 3rd week, reaching for a box he'd left on a high closet shelf, his back gave out from under him entirely, and he went down the last 4 stairs in a fall that left him on the dormitory hall floor, unable to get his legs under him. unable to do anything but call out, weakly. For a long 5 minutes before he remembered, his phone was in his coat pocket and not out of reach after all. The ER in Broken Bow's small hospital kept him overnight for observation, ran a scan that showed no new damage but plenty of old, and sent him home, home being the West Wing again, since there was nowhere else to send him, with a warning from a tired young doctor that another fall like that one might not end with only a scan and a warning. Walt drove out the next morning with groceries and an argument Dale had heard building for weeks. That he needed to stop, that the ledger and the names and the whole inherited weight of Ruth Barron's 68 years was not his debt to pay with what was left of his own body. Dale, lying flat on the front room floor because it was the only position that didn't hurt, told his cousin he was probably right and kept going anyway. 3 names still unvisited on the legal pad, and Priya's deadline now inside of 10 days. Earl Priest showed up at the hospital that same evening, unannounced, a grocery sack of soup cans and a rotisserie chicken balanced on one arm, having heard about the fall from Walt's wife at the feed store counter that afternoon. He did not say much. Earl was not a man built for long speeches, but he set the sack on the tray table, looked at Dale flat on his back with a brace around his middle and said, "You went and did for a building full of strangers what somebody once did for me, and you about broke your back doing it. Seemed only right somebody came and did a little for you." He came back twice more that week, once with a space heater for the West Wing's front room because the hospital had mentioned Dale would be going home to a building with unreliable insulation, and once simply to sit for an hour and talk about nothing in particular, the way a man sits with somebody he has decided, quietly and without saying so, he is not going to let him manage alone. Priya herself came out to the building twice in that stretch, and the second time she came without the friendly opening line. She had, she told Dale, standing in the dining hall with her notebook out and her patience visibly thinning, pulled enough from public court and county records on her own to know at least 2 of the names without needing his ledger at all. She would not say which 2. But Dale's stomach dropped, guessing, and she was done waiting on a caretaker, with no legal claim to a private document to decide when, or whether, she got to see it. "I have been fair to you," she said. "I have held this story 2 weeks longer than my editor wanted it. I need to know today whether you're going to work with me, because I am running it either way. Either way, and I would very much rather run something that has your voice and Ruth Barron's whole record in it, than something built out of what I can dig up alone, which I promise you will be messier and less kind to the people in it than whatever you're protecting them from." Dale looked at her for a long moment. The way he'd weighed every choice in the ledger's shadow for 3 weeks now, what a straight answer would cost, and what a delay would cost more. "Give me until Sunday," he said. "I've got 3 names left. Then I'll show you the whole ledger myself, and you can write whatever's true. I'm not asking you to bury it. I'm asking you to let the people in it find out from me before they find out from you." Priya studied him for a long moment, notebook still open, pen still uncapped. "Sunday," she said finally. "That's 4 days, and I want to understand why you're doing this, Mr. Kowalik. Because I've covered a lot of stories about people protecting a scandal, and you don't act like a man protecting a scandal. You act like a man finishing somebody else's work." "Maybe I am," Dale said, and did not have anything else to add to it. The last 3 names took him 4 days he did not entirely have. One was a woman named Carol something-once Vance, married and remarried since, living 40 minutes north in a town so small, the gas station doubled as the post office, who cried at her kitchen table and then, unprompted, asked if she could keep a photocopy of her own entry. "I have never once told my second husband any of this," she said, "and I think, God help me, I might now." One was a man named J.M., the faded initials from the very first dormitory room Dale had opened, tracked down through a Christmas card address in Jean's shoebox to an assisted living home 2 counties over, 90 years old himself now, and barely able to place the name Ruth Barron's at first, until Dale described the ledger entry aloud, and something in the old man's face opened like a window catching light. "She fed me for 6 weeks in 1962 and never once made me feel like a charity case," he said. "Ask that reporter to spell my name right if she's writing it. I paid it forward every year of my life since. She'd want that part in more than my sad part." The third, the young man from 6 weeks before Ruth's death, gone north, don't know, hope he's all right. Dale never found it all, and that failure sat on him harder than any of the successes. A debt of Ruth's he could not close out, no matter how many phone calls and half-remembered leads he chased. Sunday came with the first hard freeze of the year, ice on the inside of the West Wing's windows by morning, and Dale sat Priya Desai down at Ruth Behrens' own kitchen table and put the green ledger in front of her, along with the legal pad of names he'd visited and, beside each, a note on whether that person wanted their name used, wanted it withheld, or wanted to be asked first before anything ran. Of the 11 living names he had reached, 9 had said yes, use it, tell it true. 2, including Dolores Kemp, had asked, gently but firmly, that their names stay out of print entirely, their stories folded into the piece only in outline, unattributed, a request Dale had promised each of them he would carry to Priya himself, in person, before she ever touched the ledger. Priya read for 3 hours at that table, without saying much, and when she finally looked up, her reporter's face had a crack in it Dale hadn't seen before. "This isn't the story I was chasing," she said. "I was chasing negligence. 66 years, zero oversight, a county that let an old woman run an unlicensed shelter out of a condemned building, and never once checked on what could have gone wrong." She looked down at the ledger again, at Earl Priest's entry, at the boy from 6 weeks before Ruth's death that nobody could find. This is a story about what could have gone wrong for 194 people, every single year, if there hadn't been an old woman with a pension check and a set of keys standing between them and having nowhere at all. She was quiet a moment. "I still have to write about the county. That part's real. They own that building. They had a legal obligation they walked away from. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise merely because the story turned out kinder than I expected." Dale said he wasn't asking her to. He was only asking that the people be asked, not only named, and that whatever ran with Ruth Behrens' own record and Ruth Behrens' own reasons in it, not only the county's failure. The piece the Custer County Beacon ran the following Thursday was not the exposé Priya had spent 3 months building toward. It led with the ledger, not reproduced, never reproduced. Priya had agreed to that without argument, but described, its scope stated in careful numbers, 194 names, 68 years. A woman who had kept a hallway of beds, ready for strangers on nothing but her own pension, and whatever she could grow, or can, or mend to make it stretch. It named the 9 who had agreed to be named, quoted them in their own words. Earl Priest's line about her never once making him feel like a charity case set, as the piece's closing quote. It named the county's decades of looking away, plainly, without softening it. It did not name Dolores Kemp, or the one other person who had asked for privacy, and it did not print the ledger's full text. And Priya Desai's byline sat under a headline that read, simply, "The Matron's Ledger." What one woman kept, going for 68 years after the county walked away. The county could not, after that, quietly demolish a building the whole county now knew the shape of. Sharon Voss called a public hearing at the courthouse in early December, ostensibly to determine the poor farm dormitory's probate disposition, and the hearing room, a space Dale had seen used, in the weeks he'd spent haunting the courthouse halls chasing records, for maybe a dozen bored spectators on a busy day, filled past its folding chair capacity, with people standing along the back wall in coats they hadn't bothered to take off. Earl Priest spoke, plainly, about what 6 weeks in that building had meant to a 19-year-old with nowhere else to go. Judge Anders, recused from any official capacity in the matter but present anyway, spoke about 11 weeks and a bed with his own initials on the pillow, and about how a county that had forgotten to check on an old woman for 68 years owed it to her, at minimum, to stop forgetting now. Dolores Kemp did not speak, but she sat in the front row through the whole hearing, and afterward in the hallway she found Dale and told him quietly that she had decided, that morning, to tell her husband everything, and that she thought she might, eventually, be ready to say her own name out loud too. On her own schedule, the way Ruth would have let her. Sharon Voss spoke last, before the commissioners called the vote, and she did not talk like a county official reading a recommendation into the record. She talked about 11 years of closing out estates nobody claimed, and property nobody wanted, and how in all that time she had never once had a caretaker call her, unprompted, to ask permission before he did the right thing instead of the easy one. "I gave Mr. Kowalik a caretaker's contract," she told the packed room. "I did not give him a reason to spend 3 months and his own health finding 194 people and letting each of them decide, for themselves, what got said about the worst weeks of their lives. He found that reason on his own in a floorboard, and he acted on it like it was his job, when it was never anybody's job at all. I'd like the record to reflect that." The county commissioners tabled the demolition order that evening, 5 votes to none, and directed the public administrator's office to work with a newly formed town committee, Sharon Voss, Jean Ostrander, Dolores Kemp, and 2 others who'd stepped forward at the hearing, on a plan to bring the West Wing up to code as a licensed, properly regulated shelter, funded through a mix of county appropriation and a memorial fund the Beacon's readers had already, within a week of the story running, put more than $11,000 into unasked. Dale was offered, and after some hesitation took, a part-time position as the building's caretaker and maintenance coordinator. $12 an hour, 20 hours a week, work he could do standing and moving instead of sitting 11 hours in a truck seat. Not a fortune, not the sort of number that fixed a repossessed truck or paid off a decade of bad luck in one signature, but steady and his, and earned in the open instead of scraped together from a glove-box fold of bills. That work started before the ground even thawed. Volunteers turned out on Saturday mornings through the tail end of winter. Earl Priest with a truckload of scrap lumber from his own store, Judge Anders in coveralls nobody who knew him from the bench would have recognized. High schoolers, earning service hours by hauling 70 years of water-damaged plexiglass out of the East Wing in 5-gallon buckets. Dale ran the work list off the same legal pad he'd used to track the ledger's names. 1 column now instead of 2. What needs doing? Who showed up to do it? By the time the county's building inspector signed off on the West Wing's 11 beds that April, Dale had stopped thinking of the hallway as something he was guarding, and started thinking of it as something he was, in some small daily way, building. He was not at the end of it a rich man. He still owed money on the Freightliner, and he sold it that winter to a salvage buyer for less than the loan balance and made up the difference in payments he'd be making for another 2 years. He still slept, for a while, in Walt's spare room, until the county's small stipend and the caretaker wage together let him rent a 1-bedroom place on the east side of town, modest, heated, his own. What he had instead of money was something he found himself, on quiet evenings that winter, unable to fully put into words even to himself. A hallway of 11 beds he'd helped make ready again for their real purpose instead of their memory. A ledger returned by the town committee's agreement, not to a county filing cabinet, but to a locked case in the West Wing's front room, where anyone whose name was in it could come read their own page if they ever wanted to, and where a new page had already been started, in Dale's own plain hand, for whoever needed it next. The town held a small remembrance for Ruth Behrens on a cold, full Saturday in January, in the dining hall, with its buckled tables, finally cleared and swept. Not a funeral that had happened weeks earlier, small and unattended, before anyone knew what she'd been, but a proper gathering, the kind she'd never once let the county throw for the people she'd taken in, let alone for herself. Earl Priest spoke. Judge Anders spoke. Jean Ostrander read out, from his old shoebox, 3 of the Christmas cards Ruth had received over the years, unsigned by full name but warm enough that half the room was quietly crying by the 3rd one. Dale did not speak. Not really. He stood near the back by the pantry door, the same door he'd pried the hasp off of 3 months earlier, not knowing what was behind it. But when the room went around asking if anyone wanted to add anything, he said the only thing that felt true enough to say out loud, that he'd come to this county with $340 and nowhere to sleep, and that a dead woman he'd never met had, without meaning to and without ever knowing his name, taught him more about what a person owes a town than anybody he'd met in 46 years of driving through 1,000 of them without stopping. Megan called him the week after the Beacon piece ran nationally on a wire pickup, her voice different than it had been in October, less careful. She had read it twice, she said, and then read it to her roommate out loud because she couldn't get through it without stopping. She asked if she could come out and see the place sometime. Actually see it. Not only hear about it over the phone, and Dale said yes before he'd finished thinking about how long it had been since anyone in his family had asked to come see anything of his. Connie sent a card, unexpected, a plain one from the drugstore rack, with nothing printed inside it but her own handwriting. I always knew you'd land on something that mattered. I'm glad it found you. Dale kept the card on the kitchen table's windowsill, propped against the sugar tin, where he could see it most mornings without having to go looking for it. A legacy Dale understood by the time the Sandhills thawed that spring, standing on the same porch where he'd found her, was never the money a person left behind, or even the roof. It was the plain, patient record of every soul somebody had refused to let fall through the cracks, kept faithfully enough for long enough that when the record finally came to light, it asked nothing of anyone but to be carried a little further. Ruth Behrens had kept that record for 68 years without once asking to be thanked for it. Dale Kowalik, who had arrived in Broken Bow with nothing left to lose and had lost a little more before it was over, found that carrying it a little further was, in the end, the first job in a long time that had ever felt entirely worth the cost.